States cannot and should not isolate ourselves from the rest of the world. Isolation is not insulation.
We have to keep pressure on Russia to stop the war and to make truly lasting and just peace.
I look forward to defending myself and defending the people of this city as I've done throughout my entire professional career.
The mayor sought and accepted well over $100,000 in luxury travel benefits.
But first, sources tell CBS News special counsel Jack Smith has submitted his evidence in the criminal election interference case against former President Donald Trump. The extensive filing is believed to contain new details connected to Donald Trump's alleged efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Now, that's not the only legal case we are watching today. New York City Mayor Eric Adams has been indicted on 5 federal charges, which include bribery, wire fraud, and soliciting illegal foreign campaign donations. That indictment comes after several members of his administration were targeted in federal corruption investigations. We're going to start our coverage of these 2 big legal cases with our Scott MacFarlane, who has been following all of this, plus the new filing by special counsel Jack Smith. Scott, do we know what sort of evidence special counsel Smith filed today? Will any of it become public?
As the evening began, we didn't know. 5 p.m. Eastern Time, September 26th was always going to be a dramatic, tense deadline, and the deadline arrived without the drama going away, without cutting the tension. CBS News sources say the Department of Justice's special counsel has met the court obligation and filed this filing by 5 p.m. on Thursday. But all appearances from the court docket and from the court papers is it's under seal, which means it's not public facing. We can't read through it. Nobody outside of the parties involved, the judge's chambers, can read through it. That can change, though, Nancy. This is now in the hands of Judge Tanya Chutkin, who has the discretion, potentially has the discretion, to unseal this and release it for people to read, at least sections of it, maybe unredacted sections of it. But here's what we know is included. The special counsel has said in its court filings, this is going to be about 180 pages. By federal court standards, that's enormous. That's huge. They needed the judge's permission to file so much, and they did so over the defense's objections. And in court proceedings CBS News attended, the special counsel's prosecutors said this is going to include exhibits, things that may have been before the grand jury, may have been part of the FBI investigation. It may have revelations, things we don't know, despite all the exhaustive investigations of Trump's alleged efforts to overturn the election. What's uncertain, though, is when we'll see it. Could be the coming hours, could be the coming days, it could be after the 2024 election. This is now in the hands of D.C. federal judge Tanya Chutkin.
Scott, what could there be possibly at this point that we don't know? We all sat through weeks of the January 6th hearings on Capitol Hill, for example, and whether there's anything new and revelatory in this filing or not, what is the significance of the fact that it has now been filed? What happens next?
And the special counsel has met every deadline in this case, so there was every anticipation they were going to meet this one, too. The Department of Justice has a little more leverage, a little more bandwidth to investigate than that congressional committee did. So we've been working under the assumption that they have a bigger plate of things to choose from as they try to show the judge what they're going to show a jury if this goes to trial. Remember, Nancy, the whole premise here is the Department of Justice has to convince the judge they can plow ahead with this case, despite the limitations put on it by the Supreme Court giving Trump some form of presidential immunity. The special counsel kept the same 4 felonies in place, the same charges, put a superseding indictment from a new grand jury. There hasn't been a prospect. There are revelations in this filing, but as the evening began here in Washington, we were not certain when or if we'll get to see it.
A couple of months ago, we all remember the Supreme Court handed down this blockbuster decision granting former presidents broad immunity from prosecution. How does that tie into today's filing? How could that ruling have impacted what went into this filing?
And the Trump defense has tried to get this case dismissed in multiple ways, multiple times, and no doubt the Supreme Court ruling has given them something else to argue. What Jack Smith's trying to do here is to show the judge he has a case still, despite the limitations, despite some things now potentially being shielded by presidential immunity. He's still going to try to charge Trump and try Trump for obstruction and conspiracy for the actions between November 3rd, 2020 and January 6, 2021. There still is a nexus to the January 6th riot in this case. They're alleging that he used the riot to further inspire a conspiracy to overturn results. We'll see what the judge says here and whether she wants Trump's legal team to weigh in on this first and potentially share their opinions. And no doubt Trump's team does not want this public. They tried to block Jack Smith from filing such a voluminous filing in the first place.
Scott MacFarlane, you always break things down so clearly. Thank you for doing that for us tonight. Appreciate it. Now to New York City, where Mayor Eric Adams will be arraigned tomorrow on 5 federal charges in a corruption case involving nearly a decade's worth of campaign cash. Prosecutors say the mayor illegally accepted campaign contributions from Turkish nationals who were seeking to influence him. Take a listen.
It's an unfortunate day, and it's a painful day. But inside of all of that, it's a day when we will finally reveal why for 10 months I have gone through this. And I look forward to defending myself and defending the people of this city.
Our legal contributor, Jessica Levinson, is tracking all the legal developments from today. Lots of questions for her. She's standing by with more. We're following 2 major legal developments in the political world tonight. Special counsel Jack Smith has submitted new evidence in the criminal election interference case against former President Donald Trump, while a federal grand jury has indicted New York City Mayor Eric Adams on 5 charges, including bribery. Let's bring in CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson to give us her analysis. Jessica, good to see you. And unlike you, I am no legal expert, but this Eric Adams case seems pretty straightforward. There were foreign nationals, in this case Turkish nationals, who donated to him, which is against the law. They did it through straw donors, also against the law. And then in exchange, he is alleged to have done them a big favor, which is pressure New York City fire officials to allow a Turkish consulate, a new Turkish consulate, to open, even though it had not passed fire inspection. And am I wrong about the fact that this looks like it would be a pretty simple case for them to argue?
I think you're proof that you do not need a law degree to understand what's happening here. I mean, these accusations are frankly as old as time when it comes to public officials allegedly using their positions to enrich themselves as opposed to doing things for the public. So the story you lay out is exactly the story that is told in the indictment, that he got money that he should not have received, and that he, in response to obtaining that money, he said, okay, now I'll do you a favor. And it wasn't a private favor. It was a favor that only somebody in his position could try and give, which is, I will use the power I have as an elected official to try and move this building through for you. As you said, even though the fire department said, we're not quite there yet. This type of quid pro quo arrangement is the kind of quintessential thing that we look for when we think about public corruption. Now, in terms of, what are you missing? I think nothing other than that there is a big difference between facts laid out in an indictment and proving that to a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. And we are not there yet.
And what kinds of penalties could he be facing if he were to be convicted?
So we're talking about, as you said, a federal case, 5 counts here, 5 different crimes, and potentially decades in federal prison. This is very serious. And arguably, it's the most serious type of crime that a public official can be accused of. Again, it's taking a position of public trust and abusing it and using it for your own personal gain. And this is the type of corrosive crime, which, if proven, it's just alleged at this point, really hurts all of us. It hurts our faith in government.
With the time we have left, I want to talk to you about the new filing in former President Trump's case. The indictment was obviously sealed, so we don't know what Jack Smith's new evidence is. But what do you think the significance of this filing is? What were you looking to learn?
So we're looking, and I think Scott McFarland did excellent reporting this. We're looking in part to see if there's anything new. But what I'm looking at is somebody who covered the Supreme Court decision that said, yes, presidents and former presidents are entitled to some immunity from criminal prosecution. What I'm really looking for is to see how Jack Smith, the special counsel in this case, is getting around that decision, because that decision, I do think, absolutely leaves room for Jack Smith to continue with his case. But that's what I would love to see, which is he's now coming forward with factual evidence that might not have ever come to the public eye at this point. We don't know when and if it will be unsealed, but he's come forward with evidence of the investigation, trying to prove to Judge Chutkan there's plenty here that is just about private conduct, not official conduct, because the bottom line for that case is either core presidential functions or official conduct. That's off limits. That's entitled to immunity. Private conduct, go ahead and bring a criminal case.
Such a novel situation. So what happens next? Is there any possibility we see a trial before Election Day, or even another hearing before Election Day?
Another hearing, absolutely. A trial, I'm going to say no possibility. It's September 26th. The election, as we know, I think it's 40 days now. Given the huge filing that Judge Chutkan has just received, she's going to have to sift through all of this, see which allegations can continue, which will not continue. She's going to likely hold a hearing on this. There's a lot for her to go through. I don't see a world in which a trial begins before November 5th.
Jessica Levinson working overtime today with two big legal stories on her plate. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
A last-minute settlement has been reached between conservative media outlet Newsmax and voting technology firm Smartmatic. Jury selection had been set to begin in that defamation trial today in a Delaware Superior Court. Smartmatic was suing Newsmax, you'll recall, for airing false claims spread by former President Donald Trump and his Republican allies, claims that the 2020 election was rigged by the company's software, which, of course, was not true. So far, details of the settlement have not been revealed, so we don't know how much Smartmatic will be getting. Two major political figures are facing serious legal troubles. Our panel will break down the political implications for former President Trump and Mayor Eric Adams. You're streaming America Decides. Former President Donald Trump has been criticizing Vice President Kamala Harris about her planned visit to the southern border tomorrow. He said a short time ago that she should, quote, save her airfare and stay in Washington. Sophia Kai and Jasmine Wright join us now to discuss. Sophia is a national politics reporter at Axios, and Jasmine is a politics reporter at Notice. Welcome to both of you. Great to see you. I want to get to that in a minute, but I want to get to some other breaking news, which is that former President Trump, who has been doing a news conference at Trump Tower this evening, just said, Sophia, that he is going to be meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, after all, tomorrow morning, which is a surprise because just a few hours ago, his campaign was insisting that was not going to happen.
Yeah, and also, you know, about less than an hour ago, he had posted a private exchange, a message from President Zelensky to Trump about, you know, details asking for a meeting, locations of a potential meeting. I mean, usually don't do this. I mean, it's kind of a breach of trust.
Right.
But, you know, it looks like he turned around and decided that it was in his interest to have this meeting. After having a fairly fraught relationship with Zelensky in recent weeks, even calling him a great salesman, if not anything else.
Right. Yeah. And the reason that this has kind of been in the news is because Zelensky gave a pretty revealing interview to New Yorker magazine, where he basically criticized the former president, said he doesn't understand what it takes to win the war in Ukraine, and he said that Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, is too radical to be vice president. And so that's when Trump went from saying, oh, I'll probably meet with him when he's here, meeting with the president, to I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious that Zelensky is kind of putting his horse in a certain buggy here, right, with the vice president, with President Biden. because of the fact that he's very aware that Republicans don't necessarily want to continue to fund the Ukraine's war against Russia. They don't want to continue to put money and ammunition and all this kind of things that they've really been downtrodden on for the last few months, if not more. And so Zelensky recognizes that he would have more success in his fight against Russia with President Biden and if Vice President Harris was successful in November. And I think that's why you saw when Harris met with Zelensky earlier today after his meeting with Biden, well, she said, you know, I'm paraphrasing, but she said, if I can be candid right now, there are people in my country who would basically rather Ukraine just kind of throw their hands up and accept what Russia has done in the territories that they've taken and move on. But that is not what the vice president wants Ukraine to do. The vice president has actually kind of brandished her reputation on foreign policy with President Zelensky. She talks about all the time about the fact that she was presented evidence about how Russia would invade Ukraine before it happened a couple of years ago. And so this is a time for the vice president to try to show that contrast between her and Trump when it comes to foreign policy and leadership. And Zelensky kind of played into that with his comments attacking both Trump and J.D. Vance.
Right, because funding for his war effort is on the line. Sophia, another issue that divides Donald Trump and Kamala Harris is immigration. He has been railing against her this evening, as we said in that press conference. And she's going to rail right back tomorrow when she goes to the border for the first time since 2021, holding a campaign event where she's going to argue that he's the one who actually isn't tough enough when it comes to immigration.
Yeah, and this is a big area where her campaigning looked a little bit different than what President Biden was doing. She's going to the border. She's going to be talking about the bipartisan bill that she supported, that Trump tanked. And, you know, what Trump's doing here is he's trying to preempt her visit. He's, you know, of the many policy issues that his advisors want him to talk about, we know that immigration is the one that he actually enjoys talking about. So this has been his opportunity to talk about policy and get focused on something that's important in Arizona and Nevada, two key swing states that he's going to have to win, you know, in order to really have a chance.
We've seen in a few polls, Jasmine, including our own here at CBS News, that she has managed to close the gap when it comes to handling of the economy, something that Trump has long had an edge on. Right. Does her campaign think that they can close the gap on immigration as well? That's an even bigger gap for her.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they hope so. I think that that is kind of the reason why we're going to see her at the border tomorrow. I mean, it's interesting because on Wednesday we saw her giving an economy speech while they recognize that they are really cutting into Trump's lead on whether or not Americans or who Americans trust more on the economy. And they're hoping that that same thing can happen on Friday. Of course, this is the message that she's going to be delivering at the border on Friday is a much different message than what she delivered in 2019. In 2019, we saw her way further on the left, more accepting of DACA recipients, more in kind of cahoots with folks who were pro-immigration. But I think one thing that people miss about the vice president is that this shift to the right isn't just something that happened overnight. It's actually been happening since 2021 when we saw her in Mexico saying, do not come. And so it's been a real shift to the right, responding, I think, to the pressures that this administration has faced on immigration. And they recognize that a further right message on immigration is probably the one that's going to win or help them win if they do win come November.
Jasmine, you just published a really fascinating story about how some black operatives are upset with the way that the Harris campaign has been spending its money. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, it's actually an issue that comes up basically every cycle. The Democrats who say that black voters are their base have trouble funding the black political class, which includes consultants on things like paid media, grassroots operations, things that we know that really power D.C. And for white-owned firms, that those lucrative contracts come really every cycle, and they don't necessarily hit the black political class. And that's something that I think a lot of these people hoped would change with the vice president at the top of the ticket, particularly because Democrats have been concerned about the backsliding that they've seen among black voters when it comes to their support of Democrats. Now, the vice president has really done a lot better than what we saw Biden do with black voters when he was still the ticket, but it still is a problem. So our piece was looking at basically them becoming kind of furious with the Harris's campaign over the lack of investment that they see, not just to their own firms, a really important part of the Democratic circle, but also to investment of paid media across the board when it comes to Black Democrats, trying to get them to come and basically get off the couch and vote for them. And so this is an issue that has really kind of bubbled behind the scenes, causing a lot of tension as people question, where is their investments and really who is the campaign trusting to tell the vice president's story?
Sophia, have you seen any sign that the Trump campaign is going to try to capitalize on the fact that, as Jasmine says, particularly Black men have seemed to move towards the former president in larger numbers than they had before?
Yeah, from the very start of former President Trump's campaign this time, they've placed a heavy emphasis on going to places like Philly, going to Detroit, and spending money trying to reach Black men and Latino men in particular, in order to offset some of the losses or the margins that they'll have with suburban voters, with women voters. And so, behind the scenes, that's always been a focus and a conversation. One of Trump's senior advisors, Susie Wiles, she really believes that Latino men have been a reason that Republicans have been able to flip South Florida, for instance. So coming from South Florida, and now she's looking at the entire map, she is personally very invested in Latino men as well. And so Black men, Latino men, that's a place I think this cycle, we've never really seen a Republican Party invested in those demographics in the way that Trump does. And he's doing it in fairly unique ways, going to, boxing matches, sending Byron Donalds. I mean, he's doing it in the way that he feels right, which is engaging with celebrities. That's Donald Trump to a T.
And I think one anecdotal note is that I was talking to somebody who basically said that in Pennsylvania, one of their family members had received basically 10 times the amount of mail in favor of Republicans than they had from Democrats. And it's just a part of the piece we had, because right now the Harris campaign doesn't have a Black-owned mail voter firm that actually sends that mail out. And when you look at the FECs, the investments that the Harris campaign has made towards the general market, which is typically white markets, versus Black markets or Latino markets, I mean, it really is a sizable difference. And so that is the type of issue that the Black political class and really Democrats across the board are having, and it's something that Trump could really capitalize on come November.
Absolutely. Jasmine Wright, Sophia Kai, thank you so much for being with me and talking about that very important story. I appreciate it. And a quick programming note, join us here on CBS News 24/7 early on October 1st at 4 p.m. Eastern for our special vice presidential debate edition of America Decides, live from New York City. CBS News will be moderating the only VP debate and will bring you coverage all evening long. House members who are part of a bipartisan task force investigating the assassination attempts against former President Donald Trump held their first hearing today. Multiple lawmakers blamed the Secret Service for the failures that led to the gunman opening fire on Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania this summer. They also questioned why the agency didn't communicate with local law enforcement earlier and better. The panel is also looking into the second assassination attempt on Trump at his golf course earlier this month. President Biden reaffirming his commitment to Ukraine today. John Kirby joins us next to discuss President Zelensky's visit to the White House and a new $8 billion military aid package. And we're also keeping an eye on Hurricane Helene. The Category 3 storm is heading for the Florida Panhandle tonight. We'll have the latest at the top of the hour. You're streaming America Decides. Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky spent the day at the White House meeting with President Biden and Vice President Harris. Today, the president announced a new $8 billion military aid package for Kyiv. It includes missiles that have a longer range than previously supplied weapons did. White House National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby joins me now to discuss. John, thanks for being with us. This aid package to Ukraine, it includes additional Patriot battery and air defense missiles. How is this going to help advance Ukraine's effort to fend off Russia?
What you're seeing in this series of announcements that the president made today are really a range of initiatives, all designed to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs to prevail on the battlefield in coming months, all the way to the end of the year. So the big thing that the president did was make sure that he authorized the entire $5+ billion of PDA authorized for DoD, so that they can now start allocating that over the course of the next few months and towards the end of the year. That's the big thing that really came out of this. And again, what you'll see in these packages as they get announced and rolled out, as you have seen in the past, are the kinds of capabilities that are really needed on the battlefield right now. And that'll change over time as the battlefield changes. But air defense is a key priority, artillery and ammunition, armored vehicles, and of course some long-range strike missiles as well.
And did President Biden authorize that all that money go out now before the end of the year because he's concerned that if former President Trump wins the election, he might have a very different Ukraine policy come January?
He did that because he wants to make sure that we spend every dollar that Congress appropriated for us to help Ukraine, and that we have a clear path forward over the next few months to do that until the money runs out. And he wanted to make sure every dollar was spent in supporting Ukraine.
Volodymyr Zelensky was expected to present the president today with what he described as a victory plan. And I know that he's been sort of talking about that with world leaders at the UN all week. What can you tell us about that victory plan and how new, how developed it really is?
Well, I'll certainly let the Ukrainians speak to the details of it. It basically lays out a series of things that they believe that they will need to be able to enact a just and lasting peace and have Ukraine's sovereignty fully respected. The president and our team have had an initial briefing of the plan, and what the president wants is for our two teams to continue to talk about it, continue to review it and analyze it, and try to get a little bit more granularity about what's in it and what the feasibility is. But separate and distinct from that, the other message the president has delivered to President Zelensky here today is not only are we going to be with you right up until the end of this administration, he's going to continue to have all the support that he needs, but that we want to make sure, however victory is defined, however the war ends, when and if and under what circumstances, that it's being done through the lens of what's President Zelensky's vision. And what he believes is right for the people of Ukraine. As the president has said many times, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine.
I want to switch to the Mideast because last night the White House announced to great fanfare this 21-day ceasefire proposal. It worked in concert with other G7 allies, and the White House said that Israel was on board with this proposal to impose a 21-day ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon. Now, the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, says any reports of an imminent ceasefire are incorrect. And you've got Israeli military officials saying they're preparing for a possible ground invasion of Lebanon. What is going on here? Where is the disconnect?
Well, look, I would tell you a couple of things. First, I've seen Prime Minister Netanyahu's comments. We believe, and the dozen or so other nations that signed on to that call urging a ceasefire, believe that an all-out war is not in Israel's best interest. It's not in anybody's best interest. And we're going to do everything we can to try to prevent that outcome because we think, again, that's not in the Israeli people's best interest. Number two, we had multiple conversations, not just amongst ourselves, but also with Lebanon and also with Israel before that statement went out. There were multiple conversations with our interlocutors there, and we wouldn't have issued it if we weren't comfortable in those conversations. And the last thing I'd say is the conversation continues right up here in New York City. Well, I'm in Washington, but up in New York City, where the General Assembly is still going on. We still have representatives from the National Security Council up there and the State Department talking to our Israeli counterparts and having discussions about how to see if we can't move this forward. So, look, there's lots of things that are said in public, and we recognize that. I'll let Prime Minister speak to that, but I can tell you that the private discussions that we had yesterday and we're having today with our Israeli counterparts are ongoing.
I want to get your reaction to this indictment of New York City Mayor Eric Adams, because there is a potential national security implication when you've got a mayor of a major American city accused of taking money from foreign officials, in this case, Turkish officials, in exchange for what federal prosecutors allege are favors. What are the national security implications of a case like that? It's so reminiscent of what happened with Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey. That was just Egypt rather than Turkey.
Well, I sure hope you'll understand that I'm not going to talk about an ongoing investigation or these charges levied today. That's really for the Justice Department to speak to. I know they have, and I'll certainly refer to them for any future conversations.
Understood. John Kirby of the National Security Council, thanks so much for being with us. I appreciate it.
You bet.
Is climate change contributing to the severity of Hurricane Helene? Next, we're going to take you to Florida and Texas to assess how lawmakers and residents view the threat of climate change. You're streaming America Decides. Florida is bracing for the wrath of Hurricane Helene, and a common question that scientists face during natural disasters like this is, has climate change impacted the severity of these storms? Let's bring in Jim DeFede and Brian New, who are looking at the public perception of climate change in their states. Jim is an investigative reporter with CBS News Miami, and Brian is an investigative reporter with CBS News Texas. It is so great to be with both of you. Jim, I want to start with you. We have seen with major storms in the past, politicians demand help from the federal government, but then many of those same politicians will vote against climate change legislation. So how do they square those two positions?
Thank you for having me. And let me just sort of say, I think the timing of this is incredible with Hurricane Helene barreling down on Florida. You know, you can expect that Governor DeSantis, Senator Marco Rubio, Senator Rick Scott, as well as all the congressional delegation, particularly on the Republican side, will be demanding that the federal government come in and offer assistance. But at the same time, as you point out, they vote against many of the very same types of climate change legislation that might, at some point, mitigate some of these issues, might help with it. Now, they'll argue that whether some of these bills are, the Inflation Reduction Act or the infrastructure bill, which both had hundreds of millions of dollars for climate change, they didn't like certain parts of it. But what really gets to the heart of it is climate change has become a partisan issue in a way that it's really, as I talk to different folks on both sides on this, they basically see anytime you mention climate change as it being a liberal thing. Now, this is very different from what it was back in 2008, 2009, when John McCain talked about this being a priority and there was bipartisan support for it. But that bipartisan support is gone thanks largely to Donald Trump, who has dismissed climate change as something that's not real.
One thing that I've saw over my years covering Capitol Hill, Jim, was that originally there were a lot of Republicans that felt pressured to say that climate change wasn't real. And many of them have now shifted to say either that it is real but not necessarily man-made, or that it is man-made but they don't think that there's much that governments could really do about it, or that it's not fair to ask the U.S. government to do something about it if governments overseas aren't doing as much or more. Is that a shift that you have seen at the state capitol there in Florida as well?
No, I think you've exactly nailed it. Republicans will argue, why should the United States put itself at a competitive disadvantage by limiting CO2 emissions when China and India, even bigger users, aren't doing the same thing? I understand that argument. And when you talk about, Republicans who used to deny climate, one of the people I've spoken to recently for this reporting is former South Carolina Congressman Bob Inglis, who was a climate change denier. And he said he basically denied it because at the time when he was in Congress in the 90s, Al Gore was for it. So he knew he had to be against it. He's now trying to change the perception. He formed a nonprofit group which is arguing that rather than talk about it in the terms that Democrats tend to talk about it, there is a conservative argument to be made about how to tackle these climate change issues, and that if you can start to appeal to conservatives on economic grounds, that you have a better chance. So that's one of the interesting things that we're seeing, at least the discussion starting. But right now, Republicans mainly focus on mitigation without getting to the root causes of why we're seeing these severe storms.
That is so interesting. Brian, I want to turn to you now. You looked at how research shows nationally that there's a disconnect between public opinion on climate change on one hand and how elected officials vote and act on the issue on the other. Does that hold true in Texas as well?
It does. Even in red states like Texas, there's this disconnect. Research from Yale University shows that 64% of Texans are worried about global warming, and 55% believe that climate change should be a priority for the next president and Congress. And yet, many elected officials here in the state have not made addressing global warming a priority. We sat down with Dallas GOP chair, retired Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, to ask him about this apparent disconnect.
I would just like to see some very simple, reasonable minds that aren't trying to put people in one camp or the other. Just sit down and say, let's solve this thing.
So why isn't that happening? Why isn't
Brian,
the climate,
you know why that's not
why
happening.
is that not happening, that this is not a bridge issue?
Because when you're telling me that I have to, then for whatever reason, I'm going to hit the off switch. When you're telling me that I have to buy an EV, when you're telling me that I have to, have a different type of, washer dryer.
Brian, you also know that there's research that shows that compared to Democratic voters, climate issues are not as high of a priority for many Republicans. Do you find that to be the case in Texas, even after there have been several really vicious storms that have decimated parts of the state?
Yeah, we did find that to be the case, but not for everyone who traditionally votes Republican. We met Larry Howe, a lifelong Republican who lives in Plano, Texas. That's just north of Dallas. And Howe told us in recent years that he has struggled with who to vote for because the climate has become his top priority. Now, Howe recently attended a town hall meeting put on by Republican Congressman Pat Fallon. And in that meeting, Howe asked Fallon a question about whether he would support efforts to educate the public about the science of climate change. Fallon answered his question by saying Howe's idea was great, and then had this to say.
But let's be real about what we can. Not just say all these rainbowy things to get votes and to brainwash a generation with climate alerts.
He did spend several minutes talking about it.
Yeah, but again, I think it had more misleading information than information that would help bring us together. To me, that's what was missing.
Really interesting conversations. Jim DeFede and Brian New, thanks so much for being with us. I appreciate it. And that does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report with John Dickerson starts right now.